My Iridium kit hit the bottom of the metal trash can. It rang through the foyer like a dropped surgical tray. I didn't look at the champagne flutes or the marble. I watched Lieutenant Caleb Reed, no digital ID. Policy says no exceptions. Reed said it loud enough to educate the donors. He kept it quiet enough to sound like a procedure,
The situation
not
is
a
under
threat.
control. Do
I
not
watched the
interfere.
carotid in his neck jump against his starched collar. His shallow inhale never filled his lungs. His posture was a rigid, high-stress invariant lieutenant. The rank on your chest just tells me who you are on paper. Your breathing tells me you're a stroke candidate before 40. High cortisol. Step aside. I'm working on a man who actually survived a war. You haven't. No one clapped. No one laughed. The ballroom's applause bled through the glass doors in soft, scheduled waves. Chandeliers threw a cold glare across the foyer. Phones rose and hovered, recording the friction. Digital culture was deciding whether this was a spectacle or a liability. My vest said, "Logistics" in a font designed to disappear. My boots carried disinfectant on the treads. They left faint crescents on the marble that someone else would erase later. That was my public mask. Noise, labor, a moving piece of the environment. My private rules sat under it like bone. Don't become the story they can file and delete. I had been dead for a decade. It was easier to stay that way. Reed held his tablet up like a shield. The QR gate lens glowed red at his elbow, patient and righteous. He hadn't checked my name. The gate didn't need a name. It needed a code. The system loved binaries. Allowed. Denied. Clean. Contaminated. He widened his stance so the line of donors could see the red light. A performance of security. Attempted entry without valid credentials occurs at a fixed frequency, he said. His voice was a rehearsed drone, borrowed vest. No record. You think a clipboard makes you staff? His gaze flicked to a security camera dome. It was his only ally. A man in a tuxedo filmed us. His phone angled just enough to catch the light. A woman in a silver dress drifted closer. Perfume and curiosity layered over faint sanitizer. Expensive places always try to smell like control. I checked the pager at my hip. The plastic insect kicked once. Analog. Old. It wasn't connected to any network Reed could interrogate. I kept my hands open and still. Reed's smile tightened. He couldn't undo what I'd said. He tried to make the crowd hate me for it instead. See, he told them, nodding at the bin. Unidentified trash. That's what it is until it proves otherwise. Object shame is efficient. It makes witnesses complicit. Watching is always safer than intervening. My forearms held tension like a held breath. Escalation would have been easy, and easy things get noticed. I could feel the old reflexes queue up. Distance. Angle. Hands. The body offers solutions before the mind signs off. I refused them. Restraint costs more than action. The cost is paid in tendons that want to snap and don't. Reed misread that stillness as weakness. He leaned in half a step. I smelled the sour edge of stress under his cologne. You don't talk to. He stopped when his mouth went dry. His throat worked. His tongue stuck to his teeth. The crowd offered nothing. Silence was the only reaction that couldn't be audited. Security staff hovered behind him. Their weight shifted, but their feet stayed planted. Reed tapped his screen. Access denied, blinked, then reset as if a refresh could erase the room. Staff doors are on the other side, he said. His voice was controlled now. Mimicking procedure, try not to lose anything else. Reed's eyes searched my face for a fear he could manage. I gave him none. A ghost learns quickly that emotions are fingerprints. The kit in the bin wasn't just a tool. It was my edge of certainty. Steel, sterile tape, and latches that stayed closed. Without it, I was what Reed wanted me to be. A person with no proof she belonged anywhere. I reached into the trash can. Cold steel bit my fingertips. The latch had taken a dent, but the seal held. I tested it by feel. There was a small click under my thumb. Functional. I lifted the kit out and kept it low against my thigh. Reed watched the motion like it was a threat. He couldn't decide whether to stop me or let it pass. Paper Authority hates improvisation. The QR lens stayed red, insisting the world was still binary. A silhouette crossed the far end of the foyer. It was a board handler. Dark suit. Neutral face. His gaze caught Reed for half a second. Reed straightened instantly. Posture snapped into place without a word. Quiet internal discipline travels without sound. I clocked it and kept walking. Move, Reed said. It was softer now, meant only for me. I stepped past him. I was close enough to hear his breath scrape. My pager vibrated again. This time, it pressed through fabric into bone. Event scrub. The word wasn't a warning for Reed. It was a timer for me. Somewhere behind the doors, a checklist had advanced. A window had opened that didn't require witnesses to be true. I didn't turn back. The service corridor ahead narrowed into harsher light. I walked into the loud air with my kit functional. The VIP corridor sat behind the ballroom like a sealed duct. Carpet ate the sound of my boots. Halogens washed the air a clinical white. Sanitizer tried to pass for citrus, but fear lived underneath. Metallic and warm. I moved where the cameras overlapped poorly. My badge read logistics. My posture was built to be ignored. I paused in a shadow to adjust the gain on my analog receiver, checking the signal levels from the ballroom comms. My kit rode low against my thigh. The analog pager pressed at my hip, heavy enough to keep time. A strap snapped. It was a dry tear at a stitch line. A designer bag dipped. The woman caught it with a sharp inhale. Her eyes went wide. She wasn't worried about the bag. She was worried about the optics. A broken thing in a clean hallway drew attention. Two men in suits drifted past and pretended not to see. Their neutrality was paid for. The failure bothered me. Decorative stitching had been asked to carry weight. Pretty work is usually weak work. The woman saw my label and latched onto it. "Can you?" she swallowed. Asking meant admitting need. I set my kit down and the latch clicked softly. I took the bag from her hands. The leather was soft and warm. The torn seam showed pale thread and a raw edge. I pulled a short length of cord from my kit. My fingers moved with a practiced speed. Pressure. Set. Compact. Final. I tested it once and it held. The bag sat level again. My hands remembered the tension before I did. The woman's exhale was controlled. She had been holding her breath for the cameras. She touched the knot and frowned at the lack of elegance. She nodded anyway. "Thank you," I didn't answer. I picked up my kit and turned to go. Shoes arrived first. Polished soles hit the carpet in unison. A group was adjusting pace. Handlers. Dark suits. Tight spacing. Eyes scanning the path ahead. In the center walked Admiral Silas Vance. He wore authority like a tailored garment. Upright spine. Square shoulders. A face made for cameras and long meetings. Paper power carried in flesh. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the bag. His gaze landed on the repair. He stopped at the knot, as if it had teeth. The Reaper's knot. I felt it in the tendons of my hand. My memory had fired before my thought. It was a signature that didn't belong here. Vance missed a step. It wasn't enough to stumble, but it fractured the rhythm behind him. One handler's head tilted in confusion. He smoothed back to neutral a second later. Vance's breath hitched. His pupils narrowed too hard under the halogens. Colour drained from his face in a clean retreat. His right hand tremored at the wrist. A micro-failure. He killed it by curling his fingers into his palm. He made the motion look deliberate. The folder he carried flexed under the pressure. A handler leaned in to murmur. Vance lifted 2 fingers without looking back. Minimal signal. Absolute compliance. The handler stopped mid-syllable. Authority reversal doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be real. Vance's eyes tracked to my hands. Scar tissue. Old burns. Work marks. His gaze stayed there a beat too long. He knew what the system said about me. The woman with the bag smiled too brightly. Admiral, I'm so sorry. It just... Vance didn't look at her. Go, he said. The command was clipped and neutral. The woman drifted toward the ballroom. Relief was already editing her memory. The knot swung at her wrist like a secret. Phones stayed down. This corridor didn't like witnesses. Vance stepped out of formation. The handlers halted instantly. Silent discipline. He came toward me with measured steps. He stopped close enough for me to see the sweat at his temple. Where did you learn that? He asked. His voice stayed low. It was a command with the volume of confidentiality. I didn't answer. I shifted my weight, keeping my kit between us like a piece of furniture. His eyes flicked to the knot again. He looked at my face, as if he expected the dead to look different. You're not on any roster, he said. The word came out flat. He didn't respect the paperwork. You shouldn't be in this building. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Why was a dead signature here, in his corridor? Behind him, a handler took a half step forward. They were ready to solve problems without making them visible. Vance's breath steadied. The tremor was gone. Command reasserted itself over shock. Come with me, he said. I stayed still. Movement is an admission. I watched the pulse at his throat settle. His body tried to deny what his eyes had already accepted. He angled toward a service door, tucked behind a decorative panel. It was designed to disappear. Back of house. Shadowed. Not meant for donors or cameras. He didn't reach for me. He didn't need to. Authority works best when it doesn't touch. My pager vibrated again. A blunt reminder the machine was still running. Vance's gaze dropped to it. Calculation. Cost. You don't get to vanish twice, he said. I followed him into the shadow. The alternative was to stay in the light and let the system decide what happened next. A monitor alarm went thin and high. The ICU corridor tightened around the sound. Fluorescence washed everything grey. The floor smelled of alcohol wipes and warmed plastic. Bed 7, someone said. 2 badge doors and a camera dome marked the secure wing. I was still in my logistics vest. In this hallway, my scuffed boots felt like fingerprints. Staff eyes slid over my label, then paused. Security didn't like anomalies. The room at bed 7 was a knot of motion. The patient was half-propped. His chest rose wrong, too fast for too little air. A respiratory therapist worked close, shoulders locked. A doctor stood at the foot of the bed. He stared at the monitor like it was a verdict. A phone hovered near the door, angled low. Someone whispered, "That's her. Social friction carried faster than oxygen. Pressure's dropping," the doctor said. Pulses. The line jittered. The alarm changed pitch. It grew sharper. A nurse grabbed the patient's wrist. She scanned the ID band. The handheld reader chirped. No active file. It wasn't an error. It wasn't a retry. It was a clean statement. The nurse blinked and hit scan again. No active file. The doctor's jaw clenched. What does that mean? It's not pulling, she said. Her voice was thin. I saw, he snapped. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry that paperwork could veto a body. A guard at the threshold shifted. His hand drifted near his belt out of habit. Medical spaces made even armed men cautious. We need an active chart, the guard said. The patient's neck tendon jumped. The skin at his collarbone tugged inward. Machines were loud, but the body was louder. I watched effort, without efficiency. Panic was spreading through the staff. The therapist glanced at me. Are you support logistics? I said. My badge did the rest. The reader screen flickered. For half a second, a smaller field flashed. Legacy tag. It was a deep storage flag for assets the board had moved to unsearchable archives. Then it vanished. It was swallowed by the void. Someone behind the curtain whispered, "Deceased." The phone near the door tilted. The lens caught my vest and my hands. A draft of attention. Stop filming, the guard muttered. He was too late. The doctor's eyes cut to the guard. Not now. He meant the phone. But he also meant the policy. The room was choosing between procedure and the struggling thing on the bed. I stepped closer. I stayed out of the center. I could see the patient's band. Printed name. Barcode. Ink, pretending to be identity. I made a decision that would be judged either way. If they deleted Elias. They deleted the last reason I had to stay real. Give me space, I said. I wasn't polite. I was functional. The nurse froze mid-reach. The therapist's eyes flicked to my hands. He was deciding whether competence could exist in the wrong uniform. The doctor stared, as if I'd spoken out of turn in court. I didn't touch the patient. I touched the environment. I stripped a used glove off the waste bin where someone had missed it. I dropped it into the proper container. A small correction. A signal. Look at the breathing, I said. Not the numbers. Explain, the doctor demanded. I didn't. Seconds were expensive. I nodded toward the patient's neck and the shallow lift of his shoulders. The therapist's posture shifted. His hand steadied. The alarm softened. It wasn't solved, but it was less angry. Time had been bought. The doctor's thumb tapped twice against his clipboard. Checklist brain was trying to regain control. The nurse's reader chirped again. The message changed for a heartbeat. Redacted. Then the screen went blank. No warning. No error. Just empty. It was there, the nurse said. Her voice broke. The guard took one step in. We can't treat without authorization. You want me to watch him die because a database is confused? The doctor shot back. A presence filled the doorway. A man in a dark suit. No badge. Posture too neat for hospital work. He was a board handler. His eyes flicked to the blank reader, then to me. He made a note somewhere I couldn't see. Admiral Silas Vance stood behind him. He looked incidental. He didn't enter the room. His gaze went to the patient's wrist, then to my kit. He clocked a detail. Keep moving, Vance murmured. The handler obeyed. Quiet discipline. The room changed around that murmur. The guard straightened. The nurse swallowed. The doctor's spine tightened. They had been reminded of invisible superiors. I kept my eyes on the patient. It can't kill what's already dead, but it can make it suffer. My pager vibrated. 2 short pulses. Event scrub. A clean verb for a dirty action. The nurse's reader beeped again. It flashed. Access revoked. Behind us, the badge door clicked. The sound was mechanical and final. The corridor lights dimmed a fraction. The building had lowered its voice. The guard tried his badge. Red light. A flat denial beep. The doctor stared at the locked exit. He looked at the patient, then at me. He wanted an explanation for the architecture of power. I didn't give him one. The handler's shadow crossed the glass and disappeared. Somewhere in the building, something that should exist had just been erased. The alarm climbed again. It sounded like it realized we were trapped. The corridor outside the secure wing had gone quiet. Buildings only learned this silence after midnight. When cleaning crews were rerouted and air handlers dropped to their night cycle, this was the building's one-way spine. Once you moved past the first airlock, the exits thinned out until only the central elevators remained. My pager vibrated once against my hip. It wasn't an alert. It was a reminder that I was still being counted somewhere I couldn't see. A guard at the far end glanced up from his phone. His eyes flicked from my badge to my face, then back to the screen. No challenge. Not permission either. This was pressure without contact. I stepped through the glass doors as they slid apart and sealed behind me. The smell changed immediately to disinfectant and warmed plastic. Something metallic under it clung to the back of my tongue. It was the kind of place where time flattened into increments on a monitor. A nurse paused mid-stride when she saw me. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She adjusted the tablet against her chest and kept moving. The silence stretched. It wasn't empty. It was watchful. Someone had moved my access since the ICU earlier. I could feel it before I tested anything. Doors that had opened with a half-second lag now hesitated longer. They were weighing me. My reflection slid across the glass. Same clothes. Same posture. Different gravity. Phones came up along the wall. They weren't pointed at me exactly, just angled. Rumor traveled faster than data in buildings like this. A security officer cleared his throat. "You're not scheduled back here," he said. His voice was low. It was a statement designed to be corrected by someone else. "I know," I said. I kept walking. The cost ticked upward. Every step was a debit. I passed a red cart, parked crooked by the nurse's station. A single latex glove was draped over its handle like a flag. I adjusted it, smoothing it flat. The nurse watching me didn't miss the motion. Her jaw tightened. A tiny thing. It was enough. The administrator appeared at the edge of my vision. His suit was immaculate. His hair was wrong for the hour. He didn't introduce himself. His badge swung once and settled, deliberately turned so the name was hidden. Silent discipline. He matched my pace without looking at me. I scanned the green exit sign above the fire door and noted the camera blind spot behind the structural pillar. "We're consolidating access," he said. No subject. No explanation. "I'm aware," I said. The building was teaching me. He stopped. I stopped. Around us, the corridor seemed to lean in. He turned, finally. His eyes did the unfakeable thing. Not fear, but calculation interrupted by recognition. A muscle along his cheek twitched and didn't settle. He had clocked something that didn't belong in his model of the night. "You're creating liability," he said. "I exist," I said. Another debit. The open loop hung there. What would they do with me now that I didn't fit the column? A door opened behind us and closed again. Soft. Deliberate. Footsteps approached and paused. I didn't turn. The air changed when authority arrived quietly. No entourage. No noise. Just weight "Leave us," Silas Vance said. The administrator obeyed without looking back. That was the marker. Not rank, but compliance without witness. Silas stood close enough that I could smell his aftershave. Citrus and something bitter. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my hands. The unfakeable tell came then. His breath hitched once. Sharp, like a file catching on a burr. He recovered immediately, but the damage was done. He knew what I was. "You're early," he said. "So are you," I said. He nodded once. The corridor held its breath. Phones went down. The room understood. "Your presence complicates things," he said. And yet, I said. The turn came with a new cost. He reached out and touched the red cart. His fingers rested on the handle where the glove lay. He didn't pick it up. The gesture marked territory. "There's a child upstairs," he said. Not a briefing. A pressure point. Not your assignment. I thought of the faded photograph of Lena in Graves's locker. That was the only assignment that mattered. I shifted my stance, putting my weight on the balls of my feet. "Private rule over public mask, children aren't assignments," I said. His eyes flicked to mine. The authority tell changed shape. Approval would have been easy. He didn't give it. He gave consequence. "If you go further," he said, "you do it without cover." "I don't have cover," I said. "Then you lose something you haven't lost yet," he said. The building answered for him. Lights dimmed a notch. A door I hadn't touched, locked with a sound like a throat clearing. My pager vibrated again. This time it held. Event scrub pulsed on the screen and vanished. Not an error. Absence. Timeline moved. The night was folding in on itself. Silas stepped back, creating space that felt like a trap. "Make your choice," he said. He turned away. I watched his back recede. Quiet discipline spread in his wake. The red cart stood where I'd left it. I could leave. The corridor would allow it. Or I could take one step forward and accept the cost. My pager buzzed again. The door ahead of me unlocked. Then another sound, deeper in the wing. An alarm stuttered and cut off. Too quickly. I stepped forward. The fingerprint pad was colder than the air. It was a slick rectangle of glass that held onto everyone's heat and gave none back. I pressed my thumb anyway. I mapped the distance to the heavy lead-line door and counted the steps. The terminal answered with a red bloom and a reprimanding beep. Access denied. Subject, deceased. The phrase sat there like a bruise the screen refused to hide. A second beep followed. It was slower, as if the machine wanted witnesses. Silas Vance didn't look at me first. He looked at the words. His face stayed composed, but the skin over his cheekbone tightened. The security tech at the console went still. His hands hovered in the bright red spill. 2 handlers stood by the door, quiet as furniture. The room was built for containment. No windows. A door that latched with a hush. Recycled air tasted faintly of disinfectant and warm plastic. The terminal fan ticked with a dry, rhythmic friction. Glass smudges traced the last dozen fingers that had tried to make it obey. I kept my shoulders slumped. Noise labor posture. Cleaner mask. I picked up a discarded pen from the console and spun it once between my scarred knuckles. The system didn't care about my uniform. It cared that I touched a surface that could remember. "No," the tech whispered. It sounded more like a prayer than a denial. Silas' voice came out clipped. "Who authorized the scan?" "Sir." "It's a standard lockout. The station pulls from the Don't explain, Silas said. Discipline. The words shortened the room. Eyes dropped. A beige lanyard swung once, then stilled. The open loop burned in the red. Who killed me on paper? Why was a machine confident enough to say it twice? The tech swallowed. It's flagging her as deceased. I didn't correct him. The terminal had already spoken louder than any human. If they erased the log, they would admit I happened. If they kept it, I became a case number. One of the handlers took a half step forward. Admiral, this is a compliance event. We can route it through. Silas turned his head just enough. The handler stopped mid-sentence, as if he'd hit glass. Not yet, Silas said. The console beeped again. It was impatient now. The red light pulsed against the white walls. For half a second, a header field flashed in the corner, then wiped itself clean like a hand erasing chalk. I caught 2 words before they were gone. The Fallujah breach. Silas caught them too. His right hand tightened into a half fist, then opened. A tremor ran through his fingers like an electrical leak. It was an involuntary glitch you couldn't fake. Nobody else reacted. Maybe they didn't read fast enough. Maybe understanding had consequences. Silas' face didn't soften. The shame wasn't sentimental. It turned into pressure. I saw it in the way his shoulders squared. He refused to look away from the red. Lock this station, he said. No further input. Yes. Sir, the tech blurted. The handlers didn't move, but the air changed. Silence rule. Orders shorten. The room became a ledger where every motion could be counted. If this denial propagated, I wouldn't be a ghost anymore. I'd be an anomaly with a ticket number. Anomalies got contained. Silas stepped closer. The red glow painted his collar. His voice was for me now, but it still carried command. You were at the gate, he said. I stayed quiet. My mask didn't talk back to admirals in closed rooms. You touched the terminal, he continued. You knew it would respond. The pager on my belt pressed against my hip. Hard plastic under fabric. I didn't reach for it. The tech glanced at the handlers, then at Silas. Sir, if we don't clear the screen, it pushes an alert. The handler's gaze slid to the terminal. We can scrub the interaction log, he offered. The word scrub sounded like a ritual. Silas's eyes stayed on the red. If we scrub, we confirm there was something to scrub. No lecture. Just arithmetic. If we don't, the handler said, we create an active discrepancy. Silas finally looked at me fully. Not curiosity, but assessment. This decided who got to leave a room. You're not on any file, he said. And yet my name is. He didn't finish it. The corner flash had done that work. The Fallujah breach wasn't history tonight. It was a live wire tied to a dead person's fingerprint. My pager vibrated once, sharp and brief. The casing warmed against my hip. I couldn't afford to make people curious about what could reach me without network approval. Silas heard it anyway. His mouth tightened. Event scrap, he said quietly. The fact he knew the phrase told me he'd been living with it longer than I had. The handler spoke once. "Admiral, decide." Silas's gaze flicked to the latch. The handlers, the terminal, and me. He was mapping consequences. "Seal the door," he said. A security staffer moved. The hush became a lock. "With respect," the handler said, "isolating her creates custody." "Custody is already implied," Silas replied. "The terminal did that." He made his decision without ceremony. It wasn't clean. "You don't touch any more interfaces," he told me. "You don't answer questions in this room. You follow me now." He angled his body toward the door. He created a narrow corridor, only I could take. I understood the frame. Protect the ghost by keeping her out of the machine, or protect the process by sacrificing her. I'd been moving through blind spots to avoid becoming real. Now an Admiral was dragging me deeper into the building's spine. Silas reached for the badge on his lanyard. He didn't swipe it. He held it, hovering over the reader, suspended in the red glow. If he authenticated, I became a case. If he didn't, he became complicit. The terminal waited. Access denied. Subject deceased. The beep started again. The door behind us didn't sound like a door anymore. It sounded like a lid. "Gas leak," someone said. He was too fast, like he'd been waiting for the cue. The back-of-house corridor didn't smell like gas. It smelled like lemon sanitizer and chilled air. A service door closed with a soft thud. My analog pager buzzed against my hip like a trapped insect. I kept my hand off it. Silas Vance walked half a step ahead of me. Handlers materialized at intersections and then stepped away. They didn't look at my face. They watched the spaces I could move into. "Gas leak," the same handler repeated. The phrase landed like a sticker on a file. Silas turned his head a fraction toward me. His expression stayed flat. I watched his throat. No pulse spike. He wasn't surprised by the cover story. He was timing it. In an alcove, hydrangeas drooped in cheap glass. White petals showed blue bruising at the edges. It was decoration that whispered calm, while someone rearranged the truth. The handler nearest me spoke without turning. "Ma'am, for safety, we need you to come with us." Ma'am. Not my name. Not even my role. Un neutral container. Silas didn't correct him. That was its own answer. My boots made no sound on the carpet runner. Noise belonged in the ballroom. Silence belonged in corridors where decisions happened. "What's leaking?" I asked. "Gas," he said. The word was a password. "Protocol requires we clear the corridor. Fibers first." Protocol turned bodies into inventory. My pager buzzed again. Harder. Nobody laughed. Everyone pretended not to notice. Silas lifted one hand, palm down. The handlers slowed. He leaned just enough for his voice to reach only me. "If you hear a story too quickly," he said, "it's not a story. It's a plan." Ahead, double doors waited. Staff only. A keypad glowed green. One handler's eyes flicked to my hands. Prints meant I existed. Silas clocked the look and didn't look away. His authority didn't need volume. At the doors, The handler stepped into my path. This way. It's safer. Safer for who? Mipea hit me again. Time was compressing. Whatever gas leak was, it had a start time. Silas stopped. Two handlers drifted closer to me. Their shoulders angled so I couldn't step sideways. Proximity was a grip. A side door opened. He came out like the corridor had finally admitted him. My body recognized him before my mind chose words. The suit was civilian, but the posture wasn't. Weight forward, elbows loose. Old work. He looked at Silas first and gave a tiny nod. Then he looked at me. Not curiosity, but accounting. Gas leak, the handler said again. He sounded annoyed. The words were delivered with the flat rhythm of a rehearsal, not a reaction. The old teammate didn't bother with the cover story. He spoke in facts. It's a scrub window, he said. Silas's face stayed calm, but the muscles around his eyes tightened. Containment, not shock. I didn't ask what a scrub window meant. I needed intent. The old teammate kept his gaze on me. Witnesses don't survive bad optics. The lemon scent suddenly felt laid down in advance. The phrase gas leak wasn't misdirection. It was packaging. My pager buzzed again, furious. I hated how alive it made me feel in a place designed to treat me like a glitch. Silas drew a breath that stopped halfway in his chest. A hitch. The Fallujah breach lived behind his eyes like an old wound. His hand flexed once, then went still. The old teammate went on. You're useful because you don't exist on paper. You're easy because you don't exist on paper. Ehenla shifted closer. Mum, we need you separated from the VIP flow. For your protection. Protection was the prettiest word for containment. Silas's voice cut in. Not like this. 2 words. A boundary line. No resque fantasy. Just an internal rule, spoken in a corridor that had stopped obeying him. The handler didn't argue. He flicked his eyes to the teammate, checking whose authority mattered more. The old teammate's mouth didn't change. It's already decided. The men around me tightened their ring without touching. Shoulders blocked sight lines. One handler shifted, pinning my back closer to the wall. Pressure geometry. My thumb pulsed inside my glove. A fingerprint waiting to betray me. My private rule rose like bile. Don't become real to the system. My public mask held because it had to. Panic would be proof. Silas met my gaze. He wasn't offering salvation. He was offering a choice with teeth. If I went with them, I became a managed object. If I resisted, I became an incident. Either way, the system would log it. My pager vibrated again. The plastic rattle was audible. One handler's eyes dropped to my hip. Turn it over, he said. The old teammate stepped closer, closing the last safe gap. His cologne cut through the sanitizer. His voice stayed flat. Liability, he said. He was labeling me for transport. Silas didn't move. The corridor waited to see if his authority still had mass. My pager buzzed once more, relentless. The men around me tightened their ring without ever laying a hand on me. The hallway narrowed to a single point. My choice, and the hands ready to make it for me. The air in the foyer went wrong before anyone admitted it. A cough cut through the expensive scent of the floral arrangements. Then another followed, clustered and wet. The security radios on heavy leather belts stuttered into static, as if the building's infrastructure had swallowed the signal. I tasted a chemical bite at the back of my tongue. It wasn't smoke or perfume, but something clinical that wanted to be invisible. Phones rose in a synchronized wave. Behind the glass, the string quartet kept moving, a world away. In the foyer, the sound thinned into a brittle, high-tension hush. My analog pager thumped against my hip. The old plastic felt heavy as a coin. It didn't buzz. It insisted. Near the coat check, a man in a tuxedo folded at the waist. He was coughing hard enough that the tendons in his neck strained against his starched collar. A second person started to cough in sympathy. He sprayed something. A man shouted. He pointed toward the entrance, trying to aim the blame. Gas. Look at them. The word gas made the room change shape. People backed away from the coughing cluster. They realized there was nowhere to go without clearing the scanners. Bodies pressed toward the QR gate anyway. Caleb Reed remained planted there, his tablet held like a tactical shield. Reed didn't look at the chaos. He looked at the red LED on his reader, a cold procedural robot at the gate. I stayed in my slot. I remained quiet and harmless. Noise-le-bord? The mask wasn't just fabric, it was behavior. I made no sudden moves and offered no proof that I mattered to the system. My craving for control didn't care. I watched the coughing man's shoulders rise. His fingers splayed on the cold marble floor, searching for traction. I moved. 3 fast steps. No sprint. I stopped short of touching him, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his breath. His suit smelled of expensive detergent and sharp fear. Sit, I said. One word. Clipped, like I belonged to a diagnostic checklist. He obeyed. I braced a hand on the marble to see his face. His eyes tracked the overhead halogens with a mechanical lag, a sign of severe Oxygendebt. He wasn't choking on his own throat. He was fighting the air itself. I angled him toward a draft line near a service door. I used my shoulder to block recording lenses from stepping into his space. Behind me, the scanners chirped in fast bursts. Denials stacked into a digital chorus. People shoved anyway, breath against rules. Then I heard it. A phrase delivered too early and too clean. Gas leak, someone said. The voice was flat and ready. A Handler voice. Gas leak. Evacuate to designated points. The phrase landed like a password. It was a mundane misdirect designed to shrink the room into something manageable. My pager pressed again against my hip. The timing was too precise. Real accidents don't come with rehearsed sentences. I caught Silas Vance at the edge of my vision. He moved with his entourage like the corridor had been trained to part for his uniform. Authority didn't run when it wanted to be believed. A board handler leaned close to his ear, whispering about optics. I saw the posture. Keep it pretty. Keep it quiet. Silas didn't answer with a speech. He performed a 3-point check. Ceiling vents. Exits. Service corridor. No flourish. He lifted one finger, a small downward curl that stopped his handlers mid-step. Reed saw him and straightened. He took a step as if to intercept, to put himself between the authority and the problem. Silas didn't look at Reed's face. He looked at the tablet, then passed it to the coughing cluster and the glowing phones. Breaking the optics rule would be recorded by 50 lenses. He broke it anyway. "Open that," Silas said. He pointed at the back of house door near me. 2 words. No explanation. The security staffer nearest the door hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Reed. The silence in the foyer tightened. Then the hesitation collapsed under the weight of Silas's stare. A keycard flashed. A latch clicked. The door sighed open. Cooler, recycled air spilled out, smelling of stale metal but feeling safer. I guided the coughing man toward the threshold without turning him into a show. Publicly, I was noise labor moving a problem out of sight. My mask took the hit. Privately, my rule held: protect the one person I couldn't replace. Phones swung to follow us. A man in a tuxedo blocked my path, his arm out. "Don't hide it," he said into his lens. "They're covering it up." I stepped around him without making contact. I didn't give him the conflict his followers wanted. The handler voice returned, still too calm. "Gas leak. Everyone remain in place. We have it under control." The lie was in the cadence. Silas angled his body so the cameras caught his shoulder, not his face. His handlers adjusted around him. Polite bodies became a soft wall, blocking sightlines with rehearsed apologies. My pager vibrated again. It was hard enough to sting through the fabric. Silas's eyes met mine for the first time. No recognition, no reunion. Just the calculation of a man looking at a liability. "Not here," he said. He spoke almost to himself, then to the corridor. "Move her." Her. Me. A liability noun. A security staffer reached for my elbow with the gentlest grip you'd use on a drunk VIP. It was help that isolates. His fingers were tight. I didn't resist. Resistance is a flag. I let my body go with the pull. I kept my hands visible and my face neutral behind the mask. Behind us, the foyer noise spiked. More coughs followed, a wave rolling through the crowd. A phone dropped and clattered on the marble floor, still recording. "Gas leak," someone shouted, making it real by finally saying it aloud. The back of house corridor swallowed me. The door clicked shut, cutting off the ballroom's violins. For a half-second, there was only the hum of the building and the soft scuff of shoes repositioning around me. Then the pager hit again. Ahead, a handler stepped into my path. He blocked the corridor with his body, and a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. The staffer's grip tightened on my elbow. Silas's voice stayed low behind me. "She saw too much," he said. "And they're filming." The air in the corridor went wrong first. A chemical bite slid in on the ventilation and caught behind my teeth. The first cough sounded automatic, not theatrical. Then the cluster hit near the coat check, and the foyer's polished calms snapped into scripted movement. Phones rose like reflexes. They weren't calling for help. They were recording proof for the record. My analog pager thumped against my hip. The old metal insisted on being noticed. I didn't read it yet. Reading would turn this event into an order. A man in a tuxedo bent at the waist. His hand clawed at his starched collar. Tears ran hard enough to shine under the wall sconces. A woman filmed him from 2 steps back. She named the story before her lungs caught up. "Gas leak," she said. Her voice was too loud and too ready. The ballroom existed behind the glass. Music reduced to a vibration, chandeliers to a cold glare. Out here, sound was restricted to coughs, heels on marble, and security radios choking on static. I moved without permission. Compulsion wasn't bravery. It was momentum. A handler, in a dark suit, angled toward the service corridor door. The goal was to seal the mess away from the optics. He saw my logistics mask and blocked the door with his forearm. "Stay in the public area," he said. Flat. Final. I didn't look at his face. I looked at the bite of the badge clip on his pocket. His posture was a performance of calm, but sweat darkened the edge of his cuff. I pivoted away. Public mask. Harmless. Quiet. Another cough wave rolled through the foyer. Someone dropped a champagne flute. The crack of glass was too bright. People screamed as if noise itself were the threat. A uniformed medic pushed in with a bag. His eyes were tight. His gaze snagged on my boots. Then my mask. Then my kid strap. Recognition from the foyer gate lingered like residue. "Move," I said. 1 syllable. I pointed at the tuxedoed man's knees, showing the medic the way they softened. He hesitated, then dropped to 1 knee, because physics outranked the policy on my badge. The first price hit me when I straightened. Heat climbed my throat. It tasted metallic at the back of my tongue. A thin ringing filled my ears. The edges of my vision tightened into a tactical tunnel. I braced my palm on the coat check counter. Cold, laminate. Slick. I forced my breathing into a lower, controlled rhythm. A woman with pearls aimed her phone at me instead of the victim. "She's overreacting," the woman said into the lens. Attention. Seeking. They let anyone back here now. The insult was built for replay. I swallowed it. My public mask held. My private rule tightened under my ribs. Protect the one person I couldn't replace. A door alarm chirped deeper in the corridor. A small electronic bird. Then it cut off mid-note. Radios coughed again. A guard hit push to talk twice, acting as if repetition could force obedience. It didn't. Procedure was failing in real time. Across the foyer, Admiral Vance stood at the edge of the chaos. Handlers formed a quiet ring around him without touching, shaping where air and attention could reach. He watched the crowd like a casualty chart. His eyes flicked to the broken glass, then the service door, then me. Quick. Precise. Unfakeable. A suit leaned in, lips near his ear. Vance didn't turn. He lifted 2 fingers. The ring shifted without words. One handler stepped away from the service door. Another slid into place to maintain the shape. Internal discipline. No theatrics. The door opened by an inch. Permission was given without speech. I took it. The service corridor air was colder, but it wasn't clean. Sanitizer layered over something acidic, as if the building were methodically bleaching itself from the inside. My throat tightened. I coughed once, sharp and involuntary. I hated the sound because it proved I was a body in the path of a scrub. A laminated sign was taped to the wall. Gas leak drill in progress. The adhesive tape was suspiciously fresh. The sign was too ready. Someone had printed the narrative before the event occurred. My pager vibrated again. My fingers shook with a fine tremor as I pressed the button. Event scrub. Same code. Same bluntness. It was a countdown in 2 words. Behind me, the service door clicked shut. It didn't slam. It sealed with a vacuum hiss. Stay with us. A voice said. It was too gentle to be kind. A handler had followed me in, close enough that his breath warmed the back of my neck. This was help that isolates. His hand hovered near my elbow without making contact. I stepped away, putting distance between us that the narrow corridor barely allowed. My shoulder brushed a linen cart. The fabric smelled of harsh bleach and old money. Blue hydrangeas flashed in my mind, the kind of floral lye they use to soften rooms, designed for lethal decisions. The environment lied. You need physical containment, the handler said. He didn't say evaluation. He used the language of the system. Through the wall, the foyer roar was muffled now. Witnesses were becoming a weaponized pool. Somewhere out there, a clip was forming. Cleaner collapses. Disrupts gala. Causes panits. Footsteps entered behind the handlers. Measured. Expensive soles clicking on concrete. Vance stopped at a distance that made the suit straighten. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my pager, then at the sign, then at the sealed door. Not a drill, he said. 3 words. Fact. For a fraction of a second, his blankness cracked into something like recognition. Or shame. It closed again immediately. Discipline. He spoke to the handlers without raising his voice. Separate her. My stomach dropped. The order sounded like safety. It also sounded like a frame. The suits shifted, cutting off the corridor ahead and behind. No hands yet. No overt force. Just fewer exits. A tighter geometry. Liability was being shaped into a box. My thumb pressed into the pager until the edge bit skin. The handler's fingers finally closed on my elbow. Behind the sealed door, the gala kept coughing. The system, somewhere above us, kept scrubbing. The air in the foyer went wrong before anyone admitted it. One cough, then a cluster, then the wet, panicked rhythm of people trying to breathe politely under the chandeliers. The service corridor behind the ballroom looked like a hospital someone had bribed. It was lined with donor plaques and carpet thick enough to swallow the sound of a tactical retreat. The music on the other side of the glass was reduced to a dull vibration. Here, the security radios sputtered into static and died. My analog pager buzzed against my hip. Event scrub. The block letters were as calm and indifferent as a corporate invoice. Phones came up fast. Guests filmed themselves coughing, their expensive evening wear rumpled by the sudden effort to stay upright. Someone filmed me and whispered, "Trash girl." They acted as if labeling me made the unfolding disaster smaller. A hand landed on my sleeve. It wasn't a grab. It was a placement. I felt fingers with the weight of ownership. I turned. He was too close for coincidence. He smelled of industrial soap and the cold, metallic heat of electronics that had been running too long. His eyes were steady and unblinking. Old teammate. My mind didn't have to say it. My body already knew the geometry of his stance. "Still making work?" he said. His voice was low enough to fall under the threshold of the guests' recordings. A woman in pearls narrated into her camera nearby. She was too pleased to have a story for the morning news cycle. "Gas leak," she announced. "They're saying it's a gas leak. Everyone's fine." She was too ready. The headline was too clean. It was as if someone had handed her the script before her lungs had even begun to burn. "Gas leak," I repeated. I watched his eyelids for a tell. Nothing. Civilians could always be trusted to run the board's misdirect for free. My throat tightened around a faint chemical bite. People were coughing harder now. A man in a tuxedo folded at the waist, his phone still recording the scuff marks on his own shoes. Old teammate watched them like they were inventory being processed for a scrub. "You're going to come with me," he said. He spoke like he was offering simple directions to the loading dock. I noted the rigid set of his shoulders and the way he blocked the primary exit line. He was in task mode. It was the kind of clinical calm that makes other people disappear from the math. My fingers curled on the strap of my kit. The Iridium case was dented from its time in the bin, but it remained functional. My craving wasn't for revenge. It was for control. My private rule was a knot around a single name: Elias Graves. The system didn't need to hurt me directly. It could always reroute the pain through the one person I couldn't replace. Handlers began to appear at the hallway junctions. They didn't look like security until you watched how they stood in doorways. They used soft shoulders to block sightlines. There was less talking now and more synchronized repositioning. Silas Vance appeared at the far end of the corridor. He was flanked by two men in dark suits. They read as help to the donors, but as containment to anyone who had been erased. Silas's posture was a rigid invariant. His eyes were scanning the air, the exits, and the glowing phones with the speed of an auditor. He saw me. He saw the old teammate standing in my space. He didn't change his speed. This was authority that didn't need to advertise its presence. A handler leaned in and murmured a status update. Silas lifted 2 fingers, a gesture as small as punctuation. The handler peeled off toward a service door without a word. Quiet, internal discipline. No hero moment. Just motion. Old teammate shifted. He narrowed the corridor geometry until I was pinned against the industrial wallpaper. "You're in the wrong place," he said. "That's the point," I said. I hated how much of my past was packed into those 4 words. His hand rose with a precise, clipped motion. I read the intent in the line of his wrist before the impact. My shoulder muscles fired without permission. Compulsion. I moved before the mind could sign off on the risk. I shifted back. My heel slid on the carpet. The Iridium kit bumped my thigh with a dull thud. Contact still happened. It was a hard, clean impact that hit the nerve cluster. My right arm turned into dead weight. Heat flashed down my neck, followed by a sickening neurological lag. My fingers went clumsy and heavy. Then the sensation returned as a violent storm of pins and needles. Brachial plexus strike. My mind labelled it as cold as a medical chart note. It wasn't a trick. It was a consequence. A warning of what the system could authorize. I didn't make a sound. My public mask remained intact. A phone camera nearby caught the moment and tilted toward us. "He hit her," someone said. They sounded delighted. Conflict was content for the morning feed. Old teammate didn't correct the record. Silas's head turned toward us. His eyes locked on the hand near my sleeve, then on my slackened, useless arm. His face didn't change, but the muscles under his cheekbones tightened. "Enough," Silas said. It was one word. It wasn't shouted. It travelled through the noise of the coughing crowd like a physical wall. The corridor held its breath. Silas's gaze slid to my pager like it was a stain on a clean report. He didn't ask what it was. He knew it represented timing pressure. The plastic insect kicked again. Event scrap. Then, a second line appeared. It was new and colder. Hold subject. My stomach dropped. The machine had finally noticed the glitch. The database was reaching out to reclaim its corpse. Old teammate saw the flicker in my eyes. "They're making you real," he said softly. Silas snapped 2 fingers toward the nearest handler. A door at the end of the corridor clicked and locked. Another door closed behind me. The hallway narrowed, without anyone actually moving. Guests with phones were ushered away. They used gentle hands on elbows, help that isolates. A suit stepped between the lenses and the reality of the corridor without ever touching a camera. I looked for an exit and found only bodies. This was pressure geometry. I noted who blocked the cross hall. I noted who watched Silas for permission to breathe. Old teammate's hand returned to my sleeve. His grip was firmer now. Liability noun. Silas didn't raise his voice. "Vesper," he said. He used my name like he'd finally decided to spend it. "Walk." It wasn't rescue. It wasn't comfort. It was an order that forced a binary choice. Step into their process and become evidence, or resist and become the incident the cameras could sell. My arm tingled, unreliable and weak. My throat burned. The air kept getting wrong. Elias Graves existed somewhere beyond these walls. The system loved collateral. I took 1 step, then another. The locked door ahead waited for my touch. My pager kept buzzing like a countdown to an erasure. The plastic insect under my belt continued to kick. It was an old spring, and a low-frequency pulse that didn't care about chandeliers. It only cared about the timing of the scrub. Silas Vance didn't hurry. He moved at a measured pace that forced the building to obey his uniform. The handlers adjusted their spacing without being told. They stayed half a step behind us. Their hands were empty. Their faces were neutral. This was the quiet discipline of a system closing its own loops. We slipped through an unmarked door off the foyer. The ballroom became a muffled vibration behind velvet and thick glass. The scent of perfume gave way to recycled air and the sharp, acidic sting of disinfectant. The light shifted from gold to a hard, clinical white. My logistics cap and smudged jacket stopped being camouflage. They were now evidence in a live case. A second door shut behind us with a soft hydraulic sigh. It wasn't a lock. It was a decision. The room beyond was small and utilitarian. It contained a bolted desk, a security terminal, and a camera dome in the corner. The monitor threw a violent red wash across the glass and metal surfaces. "Thumb," a security tech said. He didn't meet my eyes. His badge lanyard was clipped short and tucked into his pocket. No swing. No personality. I didn't move. The fingerprint pad sat below the screen. polished by 1,000 compliant touches. I could feel the pulse in my thumb, as if my own body were already testifying against me. "You don't have to," Slepp said. The 2 words weren't permission. They were liability management. The tech tried to keep his voice normal. "Admiral, we need to close the interaction report." Interaction. Report. Gore's words used to cover a wound. Silas didn't turn his head. "Do it without her," he said. The silence stretched until it admitted the system only had one script left. My pager chirped once. I stepped forward anyway. Compulsion wasn't bravery. It was a mechanical malfunction I had lived with for 10 years. I pressed my thumb to the cold glass. The terminal answered with a tight, clean beep that wasn't a question. Access denied. Subject: deceased. The phrase sat on the screen in block letters. It was bright enough to burn. This was the machine truth. The room stopped breathing. I heard the terminal fan whining under the weight of the dead air. I lifted my thumb. The skin looked the same, but my life didn't. Silas' face didn't change. However, his right hand twitched once, a micro-tremor at the base of the thumb. He stared at the words as if they had a physical smell. The tech spoke too fast. "We can flag her for verification. It's routine." Verification would make me real in the worst way. I would become a file, a case, and a target. The system didn't erase what it couldn't index. It indexed what it intended to destroy. Silas held up one finger. The tech froze mid-motion. His fingers hovered over the keys. Silent discipline was unfakeable. "Who put those words there?" Silas asked. No one answered. People in this building didn't answer questions like that unless they wanted to be dead on paper too. Silas leaned closer to the screen. Under his cuff, a thin scar showed near his wrist. It was old and inactive. It was a past that didn't need telling. "The Fallujah breach," he said. It wasn't a story. It was a code you weren't supposed to say in a room with a recording light. The tech flinched. One handler blinked hard. Silas finally looked at me. His eyes didn't soften. They measured the cost of my pulse. "You carried my signature once," he said. He spoke quiet enough that the camera might not catch it cleanly. I kept my mouth shut. My public mask was harmless labor. My private rule was a knot around Elias Graves's breath. If I became real to the system tonight, I became leverage against a man who had already lost everything. My silent alarm vibrated again. 2 short pulses, then a longer one. Pager codes. My body read them the way it read footsteps behind me in a dark alley. Urgency. Proximity. Threat. I tugged the device free. The green backlight flickered. Scrub window moved. There was no timestamp, no explanation. There was only the fact of change. Silas saw the pager in my hand. His gaze flicked to the device, then to the tech. "Show me the blister pack note," Silas commanded. "What note?" the tech asked. He was too quick with the denial. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room shifted around him like iron filings around a magnet. The tech opened a drawer and produced a clear evidence bag. Inside was a torn blister pack. The foil had been punctured cleanly. Taped to the plastic was a strip of paper folded small. It looked harmless. That was the point of the design. He slid it across the desk towards Silas without letting his fingers touch the Admiral's skin. Respect or fear? It was the same posture. Silas didn't open it. He watched me instead. "Read," he said. It wasn't an order from a man. It was a gate from the system. If I read it, I joined the chain of complicity. If I refused, the room would choose for me. That choice would look like procedure. I picked up the bag. The plastic crackled in the dead air. The note was written in block letters that avoided any hint of personality. 2 lines. Pager codes authorize final. Liability goes first. My throat went dry. Final wasn't a word. It was a switch. "They'll start with the witnesses," I said. "The people who can talk." The tech's eyes darted to the camera dome. Someone behind me shifted. It was a subtle repositioning that blocked the door a little more. Containment without saying the word. Silas's voice stayed low. "And you are written as deceased. That makes you the easiest to bury twice." The red screen was a final verdict. If I stayed real, they would eventually find the man I was hiding. Deceased was the only safe harbor I had left. The vibrating ghost in my pocket buzzed again. It was a long vibration that felt like a hand closing around my wrist. A new message filled the green screen. "Hold for pickup." There was no location and no name. There was only the assumption I would comply with the erasure. I looked up. The handlers had already moved with the casual indifference of weather. One angled toward my left shoulder. He wasn't touching me, but he was close enough that I could feel his body heat. Another drifted to my right, sealing the remaining space. The tech's hand hovered near the door controls. He looked afraid of what his own fingers might authorize. Silas stepped back, giving the tech a clear line to the exit. His eyes stayed on mine. Protect the ghost, or protect the process? The room waited for his choice. The pager kept vibrating. Stubborn, alive, and hungry. The door behind me sighed again. This time, it sounded like the building had finally decided I was the liability that had to go first.